I found her digging a grave for herself in the middle of nowhere. Bare hands and no name. I was just a man trying to outrun his past until she gave me a reason to stop running. This isn't a story about saving someone. It's about what happens when two broken souls build something whole. A shocking revelation comes next. But before we uncover the truth that shook the entire frontier, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't want to miss more stories like this. My name is Silas Mercer, and I was 51 years old the day I found her in the canyon flats, knees in the dirt, fingers clawing at the earth like it owed her something. The sun was low and heavy, casting long shadows that made everything look like it was holding its breath, and the wind carried that sharp desert silence I'd learned not to trust. I was riding slow, mostly out of habit, headed toward the ridge where the creek used to run before the drought took it, when I spotted movement in the hollow just beyond the mesquite line. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a starved mule deer scraping at the roots for moisture. But as I got closer, I saw it was a girl, small and sunburned, no older than 14, her dress torn to ribbons and her feet bleeding from the rock. She didn't look up when my horse snorted or when I dismounted. Just kept digging, hands raw and shaking, clay packed under her nails like she'd been at it for hours. There was no shovel, no tools, just two blistered palms and a shallow pit no deeper than a grave half dug. I stood there a long while without speaking, unsure if she even knew I was real. She worked like someone chasing a finish line that might save her soul, and when her hands finally slowed, she slumped forward and whispered something I couldn't hear. I cleared my throat and said as gently as I could, "That hole ain't gonna save you." She flinched then, not like a startled animal, but like someone who'd been hit before, and she looked at me with eyes that had nothing left in them but distance and dust. No anger, no fear, just the kind of emptiness that makes a man want to kneel down and offer something warm even if he don't have it. "I wasn't trying to save me," she said, and those 5 words hit harder than a fist. I asked her name. She didn't give it. I asked who hurt her. She didn't answer. I asked if she wanted help. She turned her head away. I didn't press. I just took off my coat, knelt beside the hole she'd been trying to disappear into, and laid it over her shoulders. She sat there shaking for a long time, while the sun dipped behind the hills, and I waited beside her in silence, not as a savior, not as a rescuer, but as a man who'd once thought about digging his own hole too. When she finally stood, she didn't thank me, didn't speak again. But she walked toward my horse, slow and barefoot, and climbed up behind the saddle without being asked. Some folks bury themselves to be forgotten. She just didn't know she was meant to be found. I didn't go looking for anyone that day. Hell, I'd spent the better part of my life trying to be left alone, and the canyon flats were the kind of place a man went when he'd run out of excuses to be around people. The cabin I kept wasn't much. Just 4 walls leaning towards surrender and a stovepipe that rattled when the wind got bold. But it held its heat in winter and its quiet in every season. Most days I didn't speak to anything but the mare and the fire, and neither ever talked back. That kind of silence gets into your bones, becomes a kind of religion you don't question, just follow. I had no business stopping for that girl, no plan, no reason, and God knows I've ignored plenty of cries in my time that weren't mine to answer. But when I saw her trying to disappear into that hole she'd dug with her bare hands, I knew something was about to change and I didn't have a choice in it. I rode us back through dry sagebrush and rattling wind, the kind that whispers things you don't want to remember, and every time her arms loosened around my waist, I slowed the mare just enough to keep her steady. She didn't speak and neither did I. Not on that first day. I figured we both needed the silence to decide if we'd broken something or started something. When we reached the cabin, I climbed down first, tied off the reins, and held out my hand like I might to a wounded animal that hadn't yet decided if it wanted saving. She didn't take it, but she followed, limping barefoot across the cold earth without a sound, stepping inside a place built by a man who never expected company. I made a fire, boiled water, set a tin plate on the table without looking at her. I didn't ask questions, didn't need to. Her story was written in the way she flinched at the snap of kindling, the way her eyes tracked every door and window like escape was still an option. She sat on the floor near the stove, knees pulled to her chest, and stared at the flames like they might burn the memories off her skin. I kept my distance, made a bedroll near the door, and watched the shadows shift across the wall. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid of her, but because I wasn't. Something about her quiet made sense to me, in a way no words ever had, and that scared me more than anything. She didn't speak for 2 whole days, not one word, not even a sound, just sat curled near the stove, with her knees pulled tight to her chest, and her eyes fixed on some spot in the floorboards, like if she stared long enough, she might fall through and never have to come back up. I'd leave food by the fire and walk away without saying a thing. Pretend I didn't see the way her fingers trembled as she reached for the plate only once she was sure I wasn't watching. She ate like someone who didn't trust the meal to stay, quick, quiet bites that she chewed slow, like her throat wasn't sure it remembered how to swallow. Every time the wind knocked the shutter loose, or a log in the stove popped with a sharp crack, she'd flinch hard enough to make the air in the room shift, like pain was something she still expected to follow sound. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, never stepping between her and the door, never asking her to speak or tell me what happened or why she was out there in the first place. I'd known that kind of silence once, the kind that comes not from shyness, but from something being ripped out of you so violently that even words get scared to come back. So I let her be. I swept the floor, patched the back window where the cold crept in, cooked meals in double portions without asking if she wanted any. I kept the stove fed, the cabin warm, the nights quiet. I spoke to the mare out loud sometimes, just so there was a voice in the room besides the sound of our breathing and the fire. Told stories that didn't matter, little things about the time I chased off a bobcat with a shovel, or how the creek used to rise high enough to wash out the trail in spring. She never looked up, never smiled, but I could feel her listening. On the second night, I found her asleep, sitting up, arms wrapped tight around her legs, forehead resting on her knees like even in dreams she wasn't sure she was safe enough to unfold. I laid an extra blanket over her shoulders and left a cup of warm milk by the stove. And when I woke before dawn the next morning, the cup was empty, set neatly back on the table without a sound. It wasn't thanks, but it was something. The kind of something you don't push, don't rush. You just keep the fire going, keep the food warm, and wait for the silence to decide if it's ready to loosen its grip. It was late afternoon when we walked to the river, the kind of gold-washed hour where the sun leans just right and the wind softens for a spell. And I'd brought her along not because she asked, but because I figured the water might do us both some good. She hadn't said anything still, not a single word since the day I found her, but she followed close, quiet as a shadow, bare feet stepping where mine had already pressed the dirt down. We didn't speak as we reached the edge of the bank, the river narrow but running clear, curling over stones smoothed by time and spring thaw. I knelt to splash my face, wipe the dust from my neck, and when I looked up she was rolling her sleeves back to do the same, her elbows bony and pale, and that's when I saw it. The burn on her forearm ran jagged and angry, raised and pink like a ghost that hadn't yet learned how to fade. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't had enough time to forget either. A little higher, just beneath the collarbone, her skin bore a smaller one, cleaner, like the mouth of a bottle had been pressed there red hot, held just long enough to leave a memory behind. She didn't notice me seeing, or maybe she did and just didn't care, because she kept moving, dipping her hands in the water, washing slow. But when she leaned forward and her hair shifted, I caught the faintest mark around her neck, a thin line of skin, a shade lighter than the rest, like a necklace she hadn't chosen. Rope. Old rope, long gone, but not forgotten. The sight of it made something cold settle in my chest, the kind of cold that don't come from the river. Someone had tried to erase her, scrub her down to nothing, and they'd come damn close. You don't leave those kind of marks by accident. You don't carry them unless someone meant you to. I didn't ask her about it, didn't gasp or curse or tell her I was sorry. I just reached down, filled my canteen slow, and said, soft and steady, "Water's cold today." She didn't look at me, but she nodded once, and I saw the smallest twitch of her fingers, like maybe she was bracing for something that never came. I gave her space, let her scrub the paint off her hands without telling her it was still there. And when we walked back to the cabin, she stayed a little closer than she had on the way down. Some stories are written in scars. Hers were speaking loud. I just hadn't earned the right to answer yet. The cabin had always been just enough for one, and even that felt like too much on most days. A single room tucked into a clearing surrounded by pine that whispered all night long like it had secrets to keep. The walls were thick, but not perfect, and the stove smoked when the wind came in from the west, curling into the rafters like it had business there. My bed sat in the corner by the window, not that I used it much, and across from it was a rickety table with two mismatched chairs, one that creaked like a dying man every time you leaned back, and another that wobbled no matter where you set it. I'd never had a guest who stayed longer than a cup of coffee or a night dodging the law, but after I brought her home, I started moving things around without thinking. I swept the floor twice that first evening, folded a second blanket and laid it out near the fire, put her plate down before mine like that made some kind of difference. She didn't say a word, not even a nod to show she noticed, but she ate the stew. I ladled out and curled up in the corner afterward with her back against the wall and her knees tucked up close like she didn't trust the floor to stay still. I didn't ask her name again. Figured if it was going to come, it would, and if it didn't, well, we'd make do with silence. I started cooking for two without giving it much thought, portioning the beans and salt pork like it was a natural habit, something I'd always done. I'd chop wood and catch her watching me through the window, her face unreadable, eyes flicking away when I looked back. Sometimes she sat on the porch steps while I fixed the fence or checked the traps near the stream, always quiet, always watching, like she was learning the shape of the world again and deciding whether or not to let it in. I didn't ask for thanks and didn't expect it. Truth is, I wouldn't have known what to do with it if it came. I just kept the fire going, boiled the water before it froze, made sure she had a place to sleep where nothing could touch her. Some nights I'd hear her stir, breathing sharp like a bad dream had come to visit, and I'd toss another log on the fire without saying anything, just so the room stayed warm. It wasn't much, but it was a roof, 4 walls, and a man who meant her no harm. And sometimes, in this world, that's more than most get. The storm came in hard from the south, thunder crawling across the hills like something wounded and angry, and the rain hit the cabin roof with a force that made it sound like the sky had decided to come apart all at once. I'd seen worse storms, but there was something about this one that got into the bones, something that made the air feel tighter and the fire burn lower no matter how many logs I fed it. She was sitting where she always did, cross-legged by the wall, wrapped in the old quilt I'd left out the first night, her eyes fixed on the flames but her mind somewhere else, somewhere far away, and not entirely safe. The wind pushed through the cracks in the walls and made the windows shudder, and for a long time we just sat there like two ghosts pretending to be warm. I didn't say anything. I never did when it stormed. Some silences aren't meant to be filled. Then, somewhere between the thunder rolling and the logs popping in the stove, I heard her voice for the first time. Soft, dry, not broken, but careful. "Mara," she said. Just that. One word. Like she wasn't giving it to me, only saying it out loud to remember it still belonged to her. I didn't look over right away. I let the fire speak for a bit longer, kept my eyes on the glowing coals as if they might offer up the right words in return. Then I nodded once, slow and quiet, and said, "That's a good name." She didn't respond, didn't need to. The air felt different after that. Not lighter exactly, but clearer, like something had been carved out of the dark and given shape again. I sat back in my chair and let the storm rage, and she leaned her head against the log wall, her eyes half closed, lips still parted like the name had taken something out of her to say. I thought about all the things that must have happened before that name went silent, all the weight she'd carried into that canyon, the hole she'd been digging for herself when I found her, and how much a single word could mean when you'd almost forgotten you had one. She didn't say anything else that night, but she didn't need to. I'd been waiting for her to speak, not because I wanted answers, but because I knew how hard it is to claw your way back to your own name after someone's tried to bury it. Mara. It hung there in the cabin like smoke, soft and heavy, and I made sure the fire stayed bright until the thunder passed, and she finally drifted off to sleep without flinching. I was checking the fence line early that morning, just after the frost had begun to let go of the grass, and the sun was dragging itself slow across the tops of the pines, when I saw them boot prints in the soft dirt near the creek, not mine, not hers, too deep to belong to anything light, too far apart for someone just out on a stroll. They came in from the west, near the bluff, where the path's rough and not much good for riding, and they cut sharp around the back of the cabin like whoever left them wanted to see without being seen. I crouched down, ran a hand through the cold earth, measured the weight, the stride. This wasn't just someone passing through. This was a man moving with purpose, and not a small one either. I followed the tracks until they disappeared into pine needles thick enough to hide murder, then turned back, every step heavy with the kind of knowing you hope you're wrong about. When I stepped onto the porch, she was already standing at the door, barefoot again, wrapped in that quilt with her eyes not wide but sharp, like she'd already guessed what I found. I didn't need to say a word. She just looked past me, toward the tree line, and said flat, "He's looking for me." I didn't ask who, didn't press for names or reasons or stories too raw to repeat. All I said was, "How close?" And she shook her head once, slow. "Closer now," she whispered. There was no panic in her voice, just certainty, like the truth had finally caught up to her shadow and sat down beside it. I didn't sleep much that night. Left the lamp low and the shotgun beside the door, boots on, coat ready. Mara didn't cry. She didn't speak either. She just curled up by the fire like she knew sleep was a risk but took it anyway, one hand clutching the edge of the blanket like it could hold her here if she drifted too far. I sat by the window, watched the moon cut through the trees, listened for hooves or breath or branches bending the wrong way. There's a certain kind of quiet before bad things come, not still, but waiting, like the woods know before you do. I'd felt it in war, in ambushes, in the seconds before blood hit snow. I felt it now. She hadn't told me who he was, not yet, but I knew the shape of a hunted thing when I saw it. And I knew that whoever left those tracks wasn't just passing through. He was coming back, maybe for her, maybe for me, but I'd already made up my mind. If he came through that clearing looking for Mara, he was going to learn real fast that not everything left out in the woods stays lost. I was gathering firewood from the lean-to out back, stacking it in my arms and grumbling about the wind, chewing through the gaps in the boards again, when I knocked loose the edge of a cloth bundle, half buried under the old cot, where Mara had started keeping her things. I hadn't meant to find it, and part of me wanted to tuck it back without looking, but something in the way it spilled open stopped me cold. There was a small locket, tarnished and warm, from where it had been tucked close to her body night after night. The chain knotted like it had been yanked in a hurry. I opened it careful, half expecting it to be empty. but inside were two faces drawn in the faintest pencil. Just outlines, really. A girl and a boy, side by side, both with a single letter scrawled beneath them, M and C. No names, no dates, just those faint marks like someone had tried to preserve something even after everything else had burned. Beneath the locket was a ledger, the kind you find in old churches or schools, the leather spine warped and the edges flaking like ash. Water had soaked through most of the pages, making the ink run and the words blur. But when I turned to the middle, I found the names. A list. Simple, almost neat, handwritten in a tight, practiced script. Each name had a number beside it and a symbol I didn't recognize, and every one had been crossed out with a heavy black line. Near the bottom, just before the ink faded completely, I saw hers, Mara, and just below that, a name I didn't recognize, but knew mattered, crossed out the same as the rest. My blood ran cold, not from fear exactly, but from the kind of dread that settles in when the shape of something monstrous starts to show itself piece by piece. I closed the ledger and slipped it back into the cloth, folded it slow like it might scream if I moved too fast. I didn't mention it to her that night, just watched her from across the room while she stirred the stew and lit the lantern with practiced hands. She looked the same, but now I saw the weight she carried as something deeper, older, like she wasn't just running from a man, but from a whole chapter of her life someone had tried to erase with fire and ink. That ledger came from a place meant for prayers, but I could smell the smoke on it. Whatever happened in that church, it wasn't salvation. It was silence and ash and names crossed out, like they never mattered. But hers did, and now that I'd seen it with my own eyes, I knew she wasn't the only one who needed to be found. She was just the one who got away. She waited until the fire was low, that blue stage of dying coals where everything feels softer, like the dark has finally laid down and closed its eyes. I was sitting in my chair, boots off, a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, when she spoke, not loud, not clear, but steady enough that I knew it wasn't for herself this time. His name was Pastor Elijah Crane, she said, eyes fixed on the fire like the flames could still take shape and show his face. He said the Lord wanted us to burn away what was left of the world. I didn't move, didn't speak, just let her keep going because I knew if I did anything too soon, that voice might slip back into silence. There were 13 of us, girls, all around my age, some older, some never made it past their first night. Her voice cracked but didn't stop. We were his flock. His sparrows, he called us. Said we had to be marked to fly. She pulled up the sleeve of her dress then and showed me a scar I hadn't seen before, right at the edge of her shoulder, small but deliberate. Branded. The skin bubbled and crooked like it had come from iron, not accident. He made us memorize prayers, not ones from the Bible, ones he wrote. Called them instructions for survival. We weren't allowed to speak to anyone outside the camp. If we did, we were punished. Sometimes he'd make the others watch. Sometimes he'd make them help. I felt something burn low in my gut that had nothing to do with the fire. There was a girl named Clara, she whispered. She tried to leave. They locked her in the barn. The next morning it was gone, so was she. The next part she didn't say right away. She swallowed hard and stared into the embers like they held the memory, and she was trying to decide whether to touch it. The night I ran, he lit the chapel, said it was Judgment Day, said we had to earn our place by walking through it. I didn't. I broke a window and ran, barefoot, through thorns and cold and branches that ripped the dress right off me. I kept running until my legs gave out. I thought maybe if I buried myself, he wouldn't find me. Maybe no one would. Her voice finally gave out then, not from weakness, but from too many truths finally laid bare. I didn't try to comfort her. I just reached over, took another log from the stack, and placed it gently into the fire. Let it burn steady. Let it burn safe, because now I knew what she'd carried. And I knew beyond any doubt that whatever found her again would have to go through me first. The morning we rode into Ember Falls, the sky was the kind of gray that makes everything feel heavier than it is, like the clouds were holding their breath and the whole town was watching through them. I hadn't been there in months, maybe longer, and the main street still looked like it had been carved out by dust and stubbornness. Two crooked rows of buildings leaning toward each other, like they were too tired to stand straight. Mara sat behind me on the saddle, arms wrapped tight around my coat, chin resting just below my shoulder. She didn't say a word, but I could feel the way her eyes stayed low, the way her body tensed up as we crossed the bridge, and the first few shopkeepers looked up from their sweeping. I rode slow, not because I wanted to draw attention, but because I wanted them to see her. I wanted them to see the girl who had survived fire and rope and silence, and I wanted them to understand what kind of man she was with now. We tied the horse near the post office and walked toward the general store. I felt their eyes before I heard their voices, those soft murmurs people use when they think you're too far away to hear and not close enough to swing. "Ain't that Silas Mercer?" one said. "Who's the girl?" Whispered another. "Looks like she's been dragged through hell and back." That last one nearly earned someone a busted lip, but I kept walking, jaw tight, hand resting easy near the edge of my coat just to remind them. Inside the store, I asked for boots, something soft-soled and small, and Miss Thora behind the counter didn't even flinch. She just nodded, fetched a box, and handed it to me without comment. I told her we needed medicine too, something for scarring, and maybe a little tea to help with sleep. She brought out everything she had and wrapped it careful like it was glass. She didn't ask questions, which made her the smartest one in town that day. Mara tried on the boots in silence, wiggled her toes like she hadn't felt leather in years, and gave the smallest nod when I asked if they fit. We left with the box under my arm, and a silence thick as smoke trailing behind us. On the way out, I caught the eye of a man leaning against the saloon doors, spitting into the dirt like he owned the street. He opened his mouth to say something, but one look from me shut it for good. I made it real clear that anyone who said the wrong thing about that girl would be leaving town with fewer teeth than they arrived with. Ember Falls may not have known her story, but they sure as hell knew mine. And if she was walking beside me now, then she was mine to protect. That was the beginning and the end of it. It was sometime after midnight when I heard the horse, slow and deliberate, hooves crunching against the gravel path like they had all the time in the world. The wind had died down and the fire in the stove was a soft whisper behind me, but the sound of those hooves snapped through the quiet like a warning shot. I rose from my chair, slow and calm, reached for the shotgun leaning just inside the door, and stepped out onto the porch with bare feet and steady breath. The moon was full, casting just enough silver over the clearing for me to see him plain as day. He was tall, rail-thin, with the kind of shoulders that bend from too much preaching and not enough lifting. His coat flapped in the wind like some tattered robe, and the gelding he rode was black as pitch, with eyes too mean to be trusted. He stopped just short of the porch, lifted his chin, and called out in a voice that was too smooth to be honest. "Mara?" he said, like it was still his to say. "Come on out now. The Lord forgives the wandering sheep." I didn't blink, didn't move from where I stood with the barrel pointed low, but ready. "She ain't yours anymore," I said, my voice low and flat like a grave being shoveled. He chuckled then, the sound thin and hollow, like he was more amused than concerned. "I figured I'd find her here," he said. "The girl's got a way of latching onto broken things. I didn't rise to it. I've heard better men try worse. You've got till the count of 3 to turn that horse around," I told him. 1. He stayed still, hands resting on the saddle horn, eyes glinting like he thought I was bluffing. 2. He opened his mouth to speak again, maybe scripture, maybe a threat, didn't matter. I raised the barrel, cocked it loud enough for the sound to echo, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes that looked a little like doubt. He leaned back in the saddle, gave the reins a tug, and the gelding pawed at the dirt like it had something to say about leaving. "This ain't over," he muttered, turning the horse slowly. "For her, or for you." I watched them disappear into the trees without another word, then stood there in the cold, watching the space he left behind, like it might still try to reach out and take something from me. I didn't go back inside right away. I waited, shotgun in hand, until the fire inside burned bright again, and the only sound left was the breath of a sleeping girl safe behind my door. The Lord may forgive the wandering sheep, but I don't forget the wolves who tried to skin them, not ever. The snow had started to fall the day before, soft at first, then thick as cotton, and by the time the standoff happened, the whole riverbank was covered in a hush, so complete it felt like the world had paused to watch. I'd known it was coming, felt it building in the way the wind shifted, the way the birds left early, the way Mara had started sleeping closer to the fire again, with her boots beside her bed, like she knew she might need to run. We spotted him first, just past the tree line, his black gelding cutting through the snow like oil on water, and behind him came two more riders, silent, grim-faced, carrying that same cold righteousness in their eyes that he always wore like armor. I told her to stay inside, to keep the door barred and the pistol loaded, but she shook her head and said, "He needs to hear me." We met him by the river, the same place I'd first seen her digging at the earth, like it could swallow her pain. The air stung like broken glass, our breath rising in clouds that vanished fast, and I had my shotgun in hand, but the closer he got, the more I knew it wouldn't be enough. He dismounted slow, hands out like he was still the preacher, still the man who claimed to speak for God, and he said her name like it was a hymn he'd written. Mara stood beside me, not shaking, not shrinking, just steady, her voice clear when she said, "You don't get to own that name anymore." He called her confused, called her broken, tried to twist the memory of her into something shameful. That's when I raised the gun. His men reached for theirs, and everything snapped like dry kindling. Snow kicked up as we fired, bullets thudding into trees, into flesh, into nothing. I felt a graze on my arm, hot and sharp, and tackled one of the bastards into the frozen mud, fists swinging, breath burning. I lost track of her in the chaos until I heard her shout, not scared, not desperate, but strong. "You said God loved us, and then you set us on fire." The preacher froze. She stood 10 feet away, holding nothing but her voice, her words landing harder than any bullet. "You made us memorize prayers so we wouldn't scream," she said. "You marked us and called it mercy." He looked like he'd been shot, and in a way, he had. He lowered his weapon. His knees buckled. The fire in him sputtered out, not from fear, but from being seen. Really seen. I didn't have to finish it. He fell to his own knees in the snow and sobbed like a man who'd finally heard the truth. And just like that, it was over. The river kept flowing. The snow kept falling. And Mara, the girl they tried to bury, was the one who silenced the storm. After it was all over, after the snow had soaked through our boots and the last echo of gunfire had faded into the hills, we rode home without saying much, just the sound of hooves and the slow thaw of breath in our chests. I had a scratch that bled through my coat, and her hands were raw from gripping the reins too tight, but neither of us felt like complaining. Back at the cabin, I lit the fire and boiled water while she sat down by the stove, legs folded under her, shoulders hunched like she wasn't cold, but just unsure what to do with stillness now that the running had stopped. I didn't speak. I knew that kind of quiet. I had lived inside it myself once, after battles that no one came home from whole. She reached into her coat and pulled out that old ledger, the one with the names and the burn marks along the spine, and for a moment I thought she might toss it into the flames. Instead, she set it aside and took a blank scrap of paper from the drawer by the table. She sat with it for a while, staring, the pencil still, the cabin filled with the ticking of heat and the hiss of wood settling. Then she wrote. I didn't read over her shoulder, didn't ask. Some things ain't meant to be seen until they're ready. But I caught the first few words as she whispered them to herself while she moved the pencil slow and steady. Dear Mara, she said, you are not what they said you were. You lived. Her voice cracked at that just a little, but she kept writing. I went about the chores quiet as I could, giving her space while pretending not to watch, but I watched anyway. Not out of curiosity, but because it felt like I was witnessing something sacred. Like a name being given back to its rightful owner. She wrote for a long time, head bent, brow furrowed. The kind of concentration that comes when you're trying to say something you've never said out loud, not even in your own mind. When she finally folded the paper and slipped it into the ledger, she didn't cry. She just breathed, deep. Like her lungs had forgotten what it meant to take in air without fear. She placed the book on the shelf beside the Bible and the tin of dried tea leaves, not to hide it, but to leave it where it belonged. A part of her story, not all of it. That night she slept sound. No twitching, no murmurs, just sleep. And I sat by the window, watching the moon over the ridge, holding that line in my chest like a truth I hadn't known I needed to hear too. You are not what they said you were. You lived. Maybe that letter was for her. Maybe it was for both of us. It was just after breakfast one morning, the air still carrying that edge of winter, even though spring was pressing its hand against the ground, when she looked up from the plate and asked if she could stay. Her voice was calm, not soft like before, but certain, like she'd let herself believe it was something she could ask for. Not forever, she said, just a little while longer. I didn't answer right away, just nodded once, and stood, boots scraping against the floor as I walked to the window and looked out toward the ridge. The wind was shaking the pine branches gently, like the trees were nodding too, and that was enough for me. The next day, I started clearing out the storage nook beside the hearth, hauling old crates of bent nails and rusted hinges, pulling down boards from the shed to frame up a second room. She worked beside me without complaint, hands blistered but steady, hauling kindling and sweeping sawdust, not speaking unless she needed to. I cut the wood, she held the beams, and somehow the rhythm of building a room felt like building something more than just walls. At night, after the hammering stopped, she started sewing. Said she wanted to make her own quilt. I offered her the old one from the foot of my bed, but she shook her head and said she wanted something stitched from scratch, something made in a place where she hadn't been afraid. We rummaged through what fabric we could find, old shirts, burlap sacks, the hem of a dress she no longer wore, and she pieced it together one square at a time, each scrap a story she never had to say out loud. There was a corner made from the red cloth I used to tie my tools, a patch from the blanket she'd first slept under near the fire, and one from a dress I found folded in the bottom of a trading crate. Soft and blue like a clear morning. She didn't rush it. She sewed slow, careful, sometimes humming low under her breath, like the needle could hear her thoughts. When the room was finished, just wide enough for a bed and a window that caught the morning sun, she laid the quilt over the mattress with hands that didn't tremble anymore. Then she stood back and stared at it like it was proof that healing doesn't come all at once, but in pieces. I watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, heart full in a quiet way. She didn't thank me, and I didn't need her to. The way she smoothed that last corner down was enough. You don't need grand words to say you're home. Sometimes a stitched-together blanket and a room built with your own hands says it better than anything else ever could. It was one of those late autumn mornings when the wind moves in quiet spirals and the leaves fall slow, like they're trying not to startle the earth, when I heard the tap of her hammer against the cedar plank. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and there she was, Standing on the little stool I made her 3 winters back, nailing a sign above the door with her jaw set like she was hanging something sacred. The plank was smooth, sanded, and stained with oil we pressed from walnuts weeks earlier, and carved right into the center was a single word: belonging. No flourishes, no border, just that. She didn't look down at me or ask permission or explain a thing, and I didn't interrupt. I just leaned against the post and watched, like you watch the first snow settle or a bird build its nest, quiet, steady, reverent. When she climbed down, her hands were stained with cedar dust, and there was a smudge of something darker on her cheek, but her eyes were bright, not like fire, not like fear, like morning light. I didn't ask what the word meant because I already knew. I'd seen it in the way she folded laundry before the wind could steal it, in the way she stirred stew without measuring, trusting the scent more than the spoon. I'd heard it in the scrape of her boots across the porch when she came in, after gathering kindling, in the way she paused by the quilt she made, fingers tracing seams like old friends. I saw it when she left the door open a little longer each evening, letting the pine-scented dusk creep in, no longer afraid of shadows. That one word held everything we never said out loud. It was the answer to the hole in the ground she once tried to vanish into. It was the name of the space we'd built between 2 people, with nothing left but time and scars. And maybe that's all it ever takes to start again. Not grand gestures, not loud declarations, but one safe place, one warm stove, and the grace to stay. Sometimes we bury ourselves, not because we want to die, but because we think the world has no use for us anymore. But she dug out with cracked hands and splinters in her palms and built something better than silence. She found a reason to carve a word in wood and nail it over a doorway, not to keep things out, but to mark a return. And every time I look up at it, every time I hear the creak of the door and the rustle of that quilt on her bed, I know I didn't save her. I just stood still long enough for her to find her way back to herself. And somehow, in doing that, she gave me a way back too.